It's been said that the test of any civilization is the way it cares for those who have least power. The children, the elderly, the poor, the sick. But what if the poor and oppressed are men who've been convincingly accused of rape or murder or child abuse? Do we still rally to their side? I'm not sure we do. Witness the miscarriages of justice that have recently been in the news here in the UK. This episode takes us to Delhi in India to meet someone whose innovation deals with one of the most shocking and contradictory features of life in India, the hidden prisoners and prisons of death row. These, he explains, are emblematic of the justice gap across all of India's prisons, which are overcrowded not with convicted criminals, but with the accused, who are condemned to wait for justice.
You're listening to The Innovator's Journey, a podcast about the lives and careers of creative people, technology, and the future of work, with your host, Jonathan Winter.
Anup Surendranath, hello and welcome to The Innovator's Journey.
Hi, Jonathan. Thanks for having me.
Could you just start by telling us what you do and why it matters?
My name is Anup Surendranath, and I'm a professor of law at the National Law University in Delhi, where I also head a criminal justice program called Project 39A, which started as a research project with all of India's death row prisoners and their families to understand some very basic realities of death row in India. And I worked with a significant number of students for over a 3-year period, which really changed what I decided to do with my legal training and as a career as a law teacher. And it has been immensely satisfying to sit at that intersection of academia and practice. And I think I've learned a lot, and both sides of that work have benefited.
Great. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. But first, as you know, this is called The Innovator's Journey. So tell me, where does the Anup Surendranath story begin?
Yeah, well, my first memory is in the southern Indian city of Bangalore. Growing up with my mom and my older brother, and I guess Bangalore, which is the IT hub of India, is where the story starts. I work now in the north of India, in Delhi, which is very different. But I think growing up and now looking back at all of that, it was a life of quite a bit of struggle for my mom. And I guess despite that, she ensured that my brother and I got the best of education. And that really was the investment. And from there to one of India's leading law schools, and then Oxford for 5 years. And both the law school experience in Hyderabad and Oxford, I've been incredibly lucky to have that. And where I come from, I really had no business going to these best of institutions, and I never thought I'd had the good luck to benefit from it.
Tell me a little bit about that. You said that you had no business going to such institutions. Is that because of your relatively humble beginnings or what?
Yeah, absolutely. Right. And there were times during the law school journey in India, in the city called Hyderabad, where it did look like I'd have the money to pay the fees and get through the course. And it was a lot of fortuitous interventions from some very generous and kind people that really ensured that I finished law school and could go to Oxford.
So before we continue with that journey, just going back to what you said at first, you talked about your mother and your brother and yourself. So there was 3 of you for most of your growing up in Bangalore.
Yes, it was sort of a extremely unfortunate situation that my mother found herself in, that my father had sort of run in with the law. And I mean, I was way too young. I was a year old or 2 years old. And I, of course, have very little memory of all of this. And basically, she was from rural Kerala, and he had got her to Bangalore, and he, I don't know, for whatever reason, thought it fit to just leave her there with 2 very small kids. And I guess it would have been a lot more convenient for her to go back to her maternal home in our village, but stuck it out in the big bad city.
You mentioned that your father had run-ins with the law. Did you ever know much about that?
Yeah, I mean, of course, later on in life, I did figure out what it was about. And But even growing up as a kid, I still have this very, very clear memory of cops coming home to talk to my mother and another uncle of mine who was there, who had come from Kerala so that my mom wasn't the single woman living in this new city. So he was also there. And I can still feel that absolute sense of fear when the cops came and how terrified my mom was. And not that they were there to harass my mom or my uncle or anything of that sort, but just the fact that they were there and how that is perceived in societies like ours. I can't recollect much of it, but this for some reason has stayed with me through the years. Yeah.
And you mentioned that your mother wanted to invest in your education. Tell me a bit
Yeah.
about the investment that she made.
Yeah. And I think she had to find a way to survive. And she started.
She was working, presumably.
No, she wasn't. And she just had an undergraduate degree. She had a BA, and she really couldn't speak either the local language, which was Kannada, and the state that she came from, which is Kerala. The language there was Malayalam. So she was in a new city with an unknown language, and even her English capabilities weren't that great.
She was an educated woman, yeah?
Yes, she was. She had that degree, and she used that to teach students after school. And then she started taking more and more students, and that's how she started earning an income. And look, life, I think, sent us some good Samaritans along the way. So many of people who helped my mom survive in Bangalore. Then she taught herself further. She got yet another degree and then joined a school as a teacher. And slowly, I think she started earning enough to keep us afloat. And part of it was also paying the fees for my brother and me to very good schools, which people didn't go to in the locality that we lived in. But I think my mom was very clear that instead of investing or looking to invest in property or anything of that sort, most of what she earned went into sending us to these two schools. I mean, it's an incredible risk to take, I would think, not knowing where all of that might turn out. But I guess, I think if you ask her now, she'd be happy how it all turned out.
And I'm wondering what sort of values you feel you grew up with. What was really the most important thing in your family?
I think incredibly that despite that amount of difficulty, the deep sense of empathy that my mother would display to the students that she was teaching and the neighbors around us. And I think that really has stayed with me. Our life was such that, we were always just one illness away from not having enough to eat, right? And it's that kind of precarious existence. And me or my brother would fall ill and suddenly she'd have to borrow money. And so, despite that, the manner in which she would help others, not necessarily monetarily, but that just left a very, very deep impact on me, and just the value of uh, doing whatever you do and doing it properly, right? So the manner in which you would invest in those students who came after school, just how committed she was. I think those two values has really stayed with me through the years. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Is there any other formative experience that you remember?
Yeah, I think growing up, when I used to go to my village in the summer holidays, my grandfather was extremely involved in local politics, and I used to love the evening post sunset discussions. Everybody would come to our place and they would sit around with my grandfather and discuss very local village politics. And not that I understood much of it, but it really stayed with me a lot. And my first introduction, I guess, to politics is those conversations of the various difficulties that people in the village faced and what was being done or not being done.
Fascinating insight, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
So then you talked about your education and you went to law school in Hyderabad, and then you came to Oxford where you did your doctorate.
Yeah, actually, I spent 5 years doing 3 degrees there. Extremely fortunate to do my what is a master's in law, which is called the BCL, and the MPhil in law, and then my doctorate. Again, incredibly lucky that all of my education there was supported very generously through scholarships, and there's no way I would have afforded that.
And then you came back to India. Presumably that was always what was planned, but you had 5 years in Oxford. How was it coming back to India?
I mean, I should be very honest. It was not an easy decision. Being in Oxford for that long One is exposed to the world much more and the opportunities that the world has to offer. And there is a great temptation to, not come back to India and certainly not to academia in India. Uh,
What drew you back?
Ultimately, it was that I felt that the legal training that I was so fortunate to receive, both in Hyderabad and at Oxford, it held much more value coming back home and trying to contribute here. And I guess I also felt that I needed to see that kind of impact of my work.
Teaching in academia doesn't perhaps always realize that impact except on individuals. At what point did you feel you were fulfilling that desire to make an impact?
Yeah, I just felt, even if one were to just teach, the opportunity to shape young minds, the sort of way I was so fortunate in both the institutions that I attended, sort of just to shape young minds as they go out. And this is not to say that one needs to shape young minds to become cause lawyers. Not everybody needs to go out there and do work that is directly saving the world, not that at all, but just that whatever legal work that we do or whatever lawyers you become, just to have a certain kind of thinking and awareness about your own society and the reality of how the law functions in your society, irrespective of whether you're a banker or an insurance lawyer or a corporate lawyer or a judge, whatever, just to have that really grounded knowledge is so important, and it can help you in so many ways while you go about your life otherwise, right? And I think in societies like ours, that has to be a core function of legal education.
So, is it unusual for lawyers to really get their hands dirty, as it were, in practice whilst learning?
It's as much about disrupting practice, right, as it is about disrupting education. I think that legal practice across its legal institutions needs to serve what is understood as a justice gap in societies like ours.
So you said within a year or so of coming to the National Law University, you were starting to think about how to change things, maybe, and then you've
Yeah,
ended up in a position as chair professor on access to justice. So
yeah.
just thinking of your own journey still, what was that progression into becoming a professor and actually gaining, I guess, some influence over the
Yeah.
education process?
It was a certain execution in the early parts of 2013 that really got me thinking. It was a very politically sensitive case, and it was almost like a secret execution in Delhi's prisons. And it got me thinking of how polarized the conversation was, and yet how little we knew about the death penalty in India. And, it's probably the worst time to discuss the death penalty when there's an execution that has happened or is about to happen. You know,
It's not a dispassionate debate.
Absolutely not, right?
Mm.
And I felt that as universities, we need to grapple with these really tough questions, and that we have to be able to inject some sense of reasoned discourse into how we understand these issues and sort of laying the path forward on these issues. And unless we're able to do that, we'd be failing our social function as a university in a country like this, right? Where there's such deprivation and such suffering, that so much of resources is pumped into universities like this. There has to be a public function that you give back. And we understood so little of even the most basic amount of information. Like, we didn't even know at that point how many death row prisoners there were in India. To this day, we don't know how many death row prisoners independent India has executed. So these are all, I mean, it's all very well to shout about the death penalty and whether we should have it or not have it. But I think these polarized and polarizing issues, and increasingly so across the world, we need to base it on something concrete, right? And then have a conversation. And I just felt that we needed to know more, and we just decided to just do a project all across India on death row prisoners and their families. That meant having to get permission from each of the state governments, allowing us to meet death row prisoners, sort of a mini army of undergraduate law students fanning across the country, tracking down these families in the remotest parts of this country, convincing them to talk to us, why these strange people from Delhi have landed up at their doorstep, asking them to talk about some of their worst memories and worst experiences, looking back at the complexities that unfolded. That's why I said it seems like a crazy idea.
So this research project was a sort of catalyst for this passion you already had for closing the justice gap.
Yeah.
And so you went out there on a data collection exercise, I guess. Did you do any of the interviews yourself? Do you remember any of them?
Yeah, I did. I mean, I did almost 70% of those interviews.
Is there any story that comes to mind?
Honestly, my understanding of it at the end was that I wasn't quite ready to hear the stories that I heard, right? As much as one is academically prepared for these things and one has heard and read about these things, uh, just hearing those stories of suffering is yeah. I think the worst stories for me where prisoners would show very physical signs of torture on their bodies to me. When we were sitting right in front of each other, they would show it to me, and that really got me.
How did you cope with that?
I don't think I coped with it quite well. I think I tried blocking it out and saying that we just need to move on, right?
There's
And
presumably nothing at that stage you could do for individuals that you were talking to.
absolutely not. Yeah. And we were very clear that there would be no quid pro quo, in the sense that there was no assistance on offer. That was made very clear to every family and every death row prisoner. And yet, I think I knew that there was that unreasonable expectation that we might do something if we heard the intensity of their suffering and the extent of their suffering.
And you are presumably talking to people who, as you described with the example of torture, people who have not received access to justice.
Absolutely shocking levels of legal representation, if at all, years and years of incarceration, and that terrible lack of representation resulting in terrible decisions in their cases, lots of issues that should have been raised not being raised.
What's the scale of this problem in India? I mean, you've just described the death penalty cases. Presumably, this problem is much wider than that.
Yeah, so almost 80% of India's prison population are people who are under trials, who are yet to be found guilty, right? So they've been arrested and they've been put in prison. Their trials are yet to take place, right?
Delays and backlogs in the justice system?
Delays, backlogs, the idea that trials cannot move forward, the idea that these are extremely poor people who cannot afford bail or have been denied bail. So it's a whole sort of really poisonous mix of vulnerabilities and systemic failures that come to create this really wide justice. And I'm just talking of the criminal justice system, right? And I'm not even talking of the civil law system, where it's even worse. There's no point comparing the criminal justice system and the civil justice system.
How does this compare with other countries?
It's a shocking level of under trial population. You are keeping people in prison who've not been found guilty, right? And that we are so callous about human liberty, and that suddenly this principle that you're innocent until proven guilty has no meaning.
Because so many people are in prison for so long before even coming to trial.
Exactly. And also, in addition, there is massive overcrowding of prisons. So most prisons are operating at 150% of their capacity. But I think the state has no other way to communicate that it is serious about crime, or that it can do anything effective about crime prevention. It wants to send that message, like all governments want to, that they're not soft on crime. But they have this really inhumane solution to it, because you're not able to create governance solutions that address the proliferation of crime. And therefore, you end up saying, okay, what's the best we can come up with? Let's just throw them into prison and keep them there. And I think a large part of this apathy towards the criminal justice system is because so few of us really see these prisons, right?
Well, if you showed me a prison and we walked in together, what would I see?
I think the unsanitary conditions, and I would, if I took you to their toilets, right, or places where they bathed, or I showed you how they slept, I think it is a gross violation of some very, very basic human rights. And some of these prisons are so crowded that there's no place for people to lie down at night, right? That people have to take shifts. You have to take turns to sleep. And it's because we don't get to see these things. That world is hidden from us. I mean, at least here, prisons are such opaque institutions. There's hardly any external light on it. And that's why I said, I go back to that idea that here we are dealing with people that we don't like, and we are happy to put them away in a world that we can't see.
And you've painted a very clear picture of the problem. And in a minute, we're going to talk about what you're doing to help address that problem. Just thinking of your own position and your career and your journey, has there been any particular highlight of your career so far?
Yeah, I think, this transition from research to the kind of intervention that we do, some of the people that we spoke to as researchers, being able to get them out of prison now and getting them acquitted is immensely satisfying. And it is so great for the students who then came with me to prisons all those years back to now hear the outcome of these cases and to see that reaction in them that there is hope, that we can make these small changes in lives is immensely satisfying, right? And even then, even the time when I was working with students on that research project, the kind of things that I thought I was able to teach them through that experience, to see the reality of India's criminal justice system and the manner in which the violence of law is inflicted on the lives of people, both the prisoners themselves and what it has done to their families. No amount of classroom teaching could have done.
Thank you for telling us your personal and professional journey and how you became so passionate about this issue of justice gaps in India. Before we talk a little bit more about the innovative work you're doing now on Project 39A, I asked you to think of an artefact that would represent in some way your creative journey. And I know you've thought of one, so tell me a little bit about it.
Yeah, I have got it here. So I'm just going to try and show it to you and describe it to you.
Oh, yes. Right? Okay. What is it?
It's something that a death row prisoner sent to us. It's made out of materials he could access in prison. And it's like a guitar made out of, how do I explain this to you?
Show it to me.
Yeah.
Oh, I see. Yeah, it's a little guitar with strings, yeah. Oh, and it opens up. There's a flower inside.
Yeah.
And there's a teddy bear or so. It's beautiful, actually.
Yeah. Wow. And these are all made from discarded materials in prison, because prisoners, especially death row prisoners, find it very difficult to even get access to even basic things like paper and pen. So this is all discarded materials. And these yellow sticks that you see, these are incense sticks. Are you aware of what incense?
Okay, yeah.
I mean, I think they mainly use it to also do away with the mosquitoes in prison.
The colourful bits, what are they made of?
These are a combination of stones and shells, discarded shells. And he told us how he got this from different prisoners. And for me, the fascinating part of this is that these are people who are living lives with no real hope, right? And for somebody to put this kind of effort and this kind of bright colors and convey this kind of positivity.
What does that tell you?
Yeah, it just tells me that it just gives so much perspective on your own life, right? But it is also a burden. It's also a burden because this kind of work shows you that what you have taken on, the kind of responsibilities that my colleagues and I have taken on. And this really symbolized, I mean, I was quite struck that I've never received anything like this from prison. Of course, people write to us. There are a lot of letters, but this kind of artifact, this was the first time I was getting it. We were getting it, and all of us were quite stunned. Given all the stories of difficulties we hear, that somebody put all of this together and made it. And just that resilience of the human spirit is just incredible. What in the darkest of spaces, what people can find within themselves. It's just so inspiring. Yeah, it just makes challenges in your own life seem so small. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you. We'll be back shortly to talk in more detail about your innovation and your vision for the future of legal education in India.
You're listening to The Innovator's Journey, a podcast about the lives and careers of creative people, technology, and the future of work, with your host, Jonathan Winter.
Anup Surendranath, the innovation we're talking about is your approach to legal education and its impact on access to justice in India. Now, in that sense, I think it could be regarded as an innovation both in the academic world and also in the practice of law. Specifically, you've created something called Project 39A, which is named after Article 39A of the Indian Constitution, which requires the state to provide equal access to justice and free legal aid. So tell me about Project 39A. How does it work and what does it set out to achieve?
Yeah, it's a formal part of National Law University Delhi and one of its kind effort really in the Indian legal education space. I mean, I don't think anything like this exists or has ever been there in an Indian law school. So a large part of our work is providing legal representation to death row prisoners across India. We currently represent about 70% of all death row cases before the Supreme Court.
So it's a really significant practice that is embedded
Yes,
in an academic institution. It's almost like a criminal defense law firm.
absolutely. I think that's a good way to describe it. It's like a pro bono defense law firm, and we have full time colleagues here who work on that, a combination of litigators, social workers, mental health professionals, legal researchers, social science researchers. And it's really a combination of where there is pro bono legal representation and also research on a wide set of criminal justice areas like forensics, mental health and criminal justice, prevention of torture, provision of legal aid. We also provide legal aid to under trials in a state in Western India, in Maharashtra, where over the last 3.5 years, in collaboration with the legal aid authorities there, we provide legal aid to under trials. So that positions us to do work in India's lowest criminal courts in the districts where we're doing work on bail and actual criminal trials, but our death penalty work positions us to do work in the Supreme Court. And it's been a great journey, starting from skepticism from certain Supreme Court judges as to why a law school is in any way competent to do this or should have any business representing death row prisoners. I think we've been able to convey that, we're talking some of the poorest prisoners. Nobody who is rich is on death row. All right. It's the poor who are on death row, and it's the people who've got the worst legal representation who land up on death row often. And I mean, of course, there are some exceptions. But then I think we've been able to convey that as a law school, we take our social obligation to provide legal aid very seriously. And I think it's been a great experience for our students to be involved in this work along with my colleagues.
And they're not getting students representing them, are they? So how
Yeah.
does it work then? What team is involved in representing somebody?
So my colleagues here, the full-time colleagues at Project 39A, prepare the file, they research the evidence, they come up with the arguments, and then there are students who work with them and assist them in that. So, yeah, so that's at our level in our office. And then we approach very senior lawyers, the equivalent of what might be known as King's Counsel in Britain, to appear for us. And they appear for us pro bono. And when we started out, there was a lot of skepticism from people that, people are not going to appear pro bono and we're not going to be able to afford their fees or anything of that sort. But that has been a fascinating and very encouraging revelation over the years that these very senior lawyers, some most established criminal law practitioners appear for us in these cases. And I think the disruption at the education level is that we are saying that we are able to provide the best of legal representation in the most serious cases that a law school can do. A law school can bring this kind of quality to people who've been given the harshest punishment in our system.
You talked about the skepticism on several sides when you were getting this started. Yeah. Is there anybody who is going to be disadvantaged by having this work really well?
Not really. It's just that it's just not a system's priority, right? That it's indifference, right? And sometimes we get the reaction of why are so many resources being invested into defending such terrible people?
And what is your answer to that?
Yeah, I think my answer is very simple. What we are saying is that it is crucial that when you're giving out these harshest punishments, that the state has played according to the rules. And then it's most important that we do it in these cases where where you absolutely detest the persons concerned who have committed those crimes, where society detests that. To say that even in those cases, it is incredibly important that the rule of law be upheld, that the state be held accountable of how it investigated the case, what kind of evidence it has brought forth, how has it prosecuted. And that value, that democratic value, today it is somebody you don't like, but tomorrow it could be somebody else whose cause you might identify with and you might be sympathetic towards. And suddenly you see the state marauding and walking all over their rights. But then you have given the state too much space. You've legitimized the state trampling upon your rights.
Let's talk about your vision for the future then, the future
Yeah.
of the legal profession and legal education in India, particularly
Yeah.
legal education and its relationship with practice. If we think 3, 5, 10 years ahead, let's say 10
Yeah.
years and be ambitious, what is your vision?
I really think that for the access to justice gap to close, law schools could do with a lot more interaction with practice and sort of to infuse perspectives of learning the law theoretically and normatively or doctrinally with elements of practice. And there are multiple ways of doing that. The manner in which you might do it in competition law or technology law is very different from how you might do it in criminal justice. And I think practice could do a lot more with academic thinking influencing the practice of law.
So both can be enhanced.
Both need to be enhanced. Unless that happens, we are not going to start thinking out of the box. And societies really cannot progress when questions of justice get resolved in these sort of highly informal ways that are very problematic, right? Because access to formal institutions of justice are just so impossible. Very often in this day and age, technology is spoken about, right? And I think it does have a role to play. And I would think that academia has a very strong role to play in saying how should we navigate this use of technology in access to justice.
So if just pick up on that just for a minute, the role of technology. It's one of the things we're focusing on in this podcast. What is the future role of technology in access to justice? What is its potential?
One way is to think of access to justice in terms of accessing your entitlements, right, that the government has or whatever social welfare measures there are. And I think there technology has a big role to play, and provided we can address issues of fairness and equity in who gets to access this technology, right? I think there's a very clear urban and rural divide in terms of who is getting to use mobile phones and internet in India.
Yeah, you've talked about whole families where there's actually just one phone between the family,
Correct.
and maybe it's, I think you said, the male members of the family who might hold the phone.
There's a gender issue there, right? And also the cost of internet connectivity is very different in terms of the proportion of income of lower income groups versus middle income groups, high income groups, right? And data needs to become a lot cheaper for it to be a lot more democratized. I do believe that in terms of these role of entitlements and how you can access technology can play a great role in access to justice, provided we address issues of equity of access. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Well, you've described so clearly your vision for the future of academic education of lawyers and the link between practice and academia. You've described the role of technology. And now if I can just ask you a couple of personal reflections as we finish, looking back on your career so far, if you were to give advice to your younger self now, what would you say?
I think to have dealt with the sort of trauma that I was being exposed to vicariously a lot better.
And how would you advise yourself to do that?
I think to start by acknowledging it, I think that I am being exposed to that trauma and that the trauma is affecting me. And I don't have to pretend as though that trauma is not affecting me. And yeah, I would sort of start by acknowledging it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then if you had a giant billboard on which you could say anything to the whole world, what would you say?
I was discussing this with you, I think, the Brian Stevenson podcast and the ending of it. I think there's a message there as far as criminal justice is concerned that just like we wouldn't want to be judged by the worst things that each of us have done in our lives, that doesn't capture us, right? That doesn't define us. Similarly, to just have that sense of pause and reflection when thinking about people who commit crimes would really serve society a lot and begin to start blunting these really sharp edges around this retributive instinct in society. I know that may not fit on a billboard, but I'll figure out. I'll figure it out.
That's great. Professor Anup Surendranath, thank you so much for sharing your story, your innovation, and your vision for the future of work as a legal professor in India.
Thank you, Jonathan. This is wonderful, and really, thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to The Innovator's Journey with me, Jonathan Winter. If you enjoyed today's story, do share it with your friends and colleagues and subscribe to make sure you hear future episodes. This podcast was recorded in Riverside, edited and transcribed automatically in Descript, with algorithmic music from SoundDraw and artwork generated with DALL-E. The rest was human.